All right, good afternoon, listeners. You're listening to Lament of Hope podcast, and I'm super excited today because I'm speaking with a great author, Lois Lowry, and many of you know her work. She's written several books. She recently actually came out with one this past spring, which I have here the title Tree, Table, and Book, and it came out in April. But she's written things like The Giver and Number the Stars and the Anastasia series and Goonie Bird and so many others. Um, so one of you, all of you, bound to have read one of her books. But she was very kind enough to jump on and just discuss life with me and get to know her in a more personal level. So, Lois, thanks so much for taking the time.
You are quite welcome. And you know what I didn't think to ask you in our little preliminary talk before you turned on the official interview is where you are.
Oh, I am right outside of Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay. And I'm in Maine, but I have a house in Florida on the West Coast. So during the day, we've been watching the TV to see if we've been swept away by the hurricane because this is October, or what's the date? 10th.
Yeah.
However, our house is still standing, so that's good news. But I'm currently in Maine.
Is it in the path of the hurricane at all?
Yes, it was right there, right there.
Really? Oh,
Yeah.
wow. And
So,
did it pass your house, or are you still waiting to see if it?
we have heard from Florida that it's okay. So.
Wow. I wanted to ask you, Lois, because when I was looking and researching, I saw one of the things you'd written, and you said that one of the reasons you write is you want to bring people together and you want people to connect and to be able to care and have compassion for one another. Is there a time in your life when you felt the most disconnected from people?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. The problem with a really interesting question is that I don't have a quick, glib answer. It requires a little bit of thought, a time when I felt disconnected. Um, I guess the closest I can come to a true answer to that question would be I was divorced when I was 40. I'm now 87, so that's 47 years ago. But I happen to have a very good memory all the way back to age 4. So,
No.
uh, age 40, 47 years ago is easy for me to remember. And of course, a family breaking up is a tough time. But it's also a time I discovered, and I think probably others have as well, that people either either are compassionate or they turn their back because they don't want to enter that realm where you are. So that was a time that was difficult for me. I got through it, obviously. But in answer to your question, that was the time that came to mind.
Like did you have a lot of friends who just didn't want to be involved in your life anymore, or?
Well, when you're a couple, and I was part of a married couple, you have a lot of friends who are friends of you as a couple. And
Sure.
then when you split up, some of them felt that they had to take sides is a too glib phrase, but some of them sort of turned their backs on me. And I think the reverse probably happened. Some of them probably turned their backs on my ex-husband. It's inevitable and it's a painful thing, but you get through it. And also, new friends appear and a new part of your life begins, which is exhilarating. And so pretty soon, that became a very positive thing. That was when I became a writer. And so a lot of new things were happening. And so my memory does not dwell on that moment of disconnection that you asked about.
Do you mind if I ask why you ended up divorcing? Because you were with your husband a long time, right?
Yes, and I think he would probably answer this the same way. We got married when we were kids.
Mm.
I had just turned 19, and he was 21, and people should not get married that young. I shouldn't make a blanket statement like that, but you're not fully developed as a human being. You aren't yet who you are going to become. And in many cases, people who marry that young grow in different directions, and the marriage ceases to work. I should add that my ex-husband went on to marry somebody very happily, as did I. But now I've forgotten what I was answering, but I guess it had to do with why a marriage ends, and that can take many forms, of course. But I think a frequent one is that people married too young before they were mature.
Yeah. Do you have, when did you know it was gonna end?
That's another interesting question, and one I'm not sure I can answer. Because I said I married just after I turned 19. I had a baby when I was 20, almost 21. And then I had another baby when I was 21, and another baby when I was 23, and another baby when I was 24. So almost immediately, I had a big family to take care of. And my children became my life. And I wasn't, I guess I wasn't aware of other things that were not working because my life with my children was very happy. I loved having children. Actually, I think in retrospect, that's why I got married so young, because I wanted children so badly. But it also meant, sadly, that I gave up my education. I dropped out of college, and so much later, I went back to school, finished college, went to graduate school, but it meant that my life, the progression of my life did not take a steady course. Most people are educated and then they get a job and then they get married. I never had a job. I stopped my education. I married, had children very young. And
Hmm.
then when it ceased working and we were divorced, I had to make a living for the first time. And I had never had a job. And I was 40 years old. That's when I
Wow.
wrote my first book. So everything seemed chronologically a little askew, although it worked out okay in the end.
What job did you, because I'm guessing even though you did write a book, didn't you would probably were working as well and doing some sort of job.
No, I was
No?
first going to college to finish college in my
Okay.
30s, then going to graduate school. In graduate school, I studied photography. Still married, living in a big house with all these children. I set up a dark room. I loved children. I've already told you that. And I began to do two things. I began to photograph children, and people hired me to do that. So that, I guess you could call that a job. I certainly didn't make much money at it. I ended up, though, with the photograph of the young girl that appeared on the cover. I've got a copy of it here. Um, Number of the Stars.
Oh
This
yeah.
this was a child whose parents had hired me to photograph her. And many years later, when I wrote this book and the publisher was trying to decide what kind of cover to put on it, I gave them a copy. I still had copies of these old photographs I had done for people. And I gave them this photograph and said they were going to hire a painter, an artist, an illustrator. And I said the girl should look like this. This child was Swedish. And so they called me and said, could we use the photograph? And so I said, well, I'd have to get permission. And I tracked down her parents, reached them and explained and got asked their permission, and they started to laugh and they said, you'll have to ask her. I've forgotten how old, but she was 29 or something by then. She may have grandchildren. She has four grown children herself.
Wow.
But her face is still out there on thousands, perhaps millions of these books. At any rate, that was sort of a job. It was something I did at home. I loved doing it. My kids, I remember they knew they were teenagers by then. They were not allowed to enter the dark room because that would wreck whatever photograph I was working on. But they would knock and say, "Mom, are you ever going to cook dinner? You've been in there for 4 hours." I loved it so much, and the time seemed to pass so quickly.
Hmm.
And the joy of I was very fortunate to this was true of writing as well. The exhilaration, the joy of doing something creative, of coming up with something that I had made that was beautiful. Um, as I said, same thing with writing, which I was beginning to do. Something I had created was very satisfying to me. I was very lucky, having no other skills, that I was able quite quickly to make a living doing those two things that were creative and very satisfying.
Yeah. Did you wish it had been different, or do you not regret the fact that it was reversed, that you ended up going to school later?
Um, every now and then, somebody at a dinner party or something will raise the question, is there what in your life do you wish you had done differently? And I sometimes immediately think I should not have dropped out of college. I was on the dean's list at Brown University, and but if I had stayed in school, what would I have become? I would have graduated from college. I probably would have gotten a low-level job in publishing, and maybe today I would be, well, today I'd be retired, but maybe I would have gone on in publishing and been an editor. That would not have been as satisfying as what I actually did. So in retrospect, I don't wish I had done it differently, but it was not anything I would recommend to people that they do, that they drop out of, that they don't complete their education.
Yeah. You know, you were talking about how much you loved motherhood, but also you love your creative passions. Especially in the culture we're in now, it almost feels like you have to pick one. And I think there's that pressure. You either choose to be a mother and give up what you love, or you do what you love and you don't have kids. You got to pick one or the other because you can't do both well.
Well, I think some people do both well, but I think it must be very, very hard.
Yeah. Did you feel like you sacrificed more on one or the other?
Because it worked out well for me, when I look back on it, I don't see the negative parts. And yet, I guess I can't answer that question. For me, it worked, but it was not easy to make it work. But it did. I would not have wanted to be somebody who, when I was raising small children, and they were all born in 5 years, so they were all small together, I would not have wanted to have a full-time job and have to leave them with, daycare or nannies or whatever people do. That would have been very hard. And I loved staying home with my kids.
When you were with your little ones, did you ever do creative things with them?
Oh, sure. I'm sorry they're not here to answer that. I actually Zoom every Tuesday with my two daughters. And yesterday, today's Wednesday, is it not? I've
It's
lost track.
Thursday.
Okay, so 2 days ago, I Zoomed with my daughters, and on that day, my son joined us. So there were the three kids, and we often raise interesting questions that to which we all respond in our various ways. And that would have been an interesting question to ask them. Did your mom do creative things? And I feel quite certain they would say yes, and they would start to laugh, and they would remember some amusing things. Uh, I can remember. I should add that their father, who was a lawyer, sometimes didn't find them as amusing as we did. But I remember holding a dance in the kitchen, and we played music and danced. I mean, that sounds silly, and it was silly, but we had fun. The kids and I had a lot of fun together.
Did they, did you ever get annoyed with, because you know how children love to play. There's like this non-ending desire for attention and play. And I know sometimes for some adults it's very tiring and kind of like they just want their children to be calm, and sometimes they just put a phone in front of them and they're like, just sit there and look at the phone for an hour and stop talking. For you as a mom, was that ever something that was hard
You
for you,
know,
or you just loved that?
at the time that my kids were young, there were no phones or computers or
Yeah.
laptops or any of that. So there, I think the time lent itself to more creative play. And if I go back even farther to the time that I was a child, there was no television. And my mother had been a kindergarten teacher before she married. So there was a lot of creative play in my childhood home. And then with my own children, still, I think we made time for and we enjoyed creativity together. I I'm now thinking about my grandchildren, and I, of course, wasn't with them full time, so I can't really testify to their upbringing. But by the time they came along, and they're grown now, my youngest grandchild just graduated from college.
Wow.
By the time they came along, there were computers and various distractions that took them away, probably from the kind of free creativity that my own children enjoyed.
You mentioned earlier, you said you can remember memories when you were 4. What is your first memory? Because I don't remember anything when I was 4. I don't even think I remember anything until I'm like 8 or 10.
Um, I was born in Honolulu, and we left there when I was 3. I was born in 1937, so we left there just before the Pearl Harbor was bombed, just before I was 4 years old. And I my very earliest memory is a very blurred and hazy sensation. My mother's long dead, but I remember asking her about this. I'm standing in a doorway and there are flowers everywhere. And I remember saying, Mom, where would that have been? And she said that was Hawaii. There were flowers all around the doorway. So I was no more than 3, but it's very blurred. Okay, but at first clear memories when I'm 4. I remember the day that Pearl Harbor was bombed because we were
Hmm.
living in New York then. My father was an Army officer. And my mother, no television, but every household had a radio, which was a big piece of furniture. The radio was on. My mother heard something, and it was about Hawaii. And I knew that we had lived in Hawaii. And I could see that my mother was very upset, and she ran to the front door. And my dad was out at the curb in the car. He was about to go someplace, I don't know where. It would have been evening on the East Coast where we were. And she called to him, and he rolled down the window of the car. And she went out and told him what she had heard on the radio. And I remember that she said, You have to come in and put your uniform on. This is something I neglected to ask her, and I've always wondered about it. Was that a requirement? Did they say on the radio, do you think, all military personnel must be in uniform? It was a
Hmm.
Sunday night. My father came in and put on his whole Army major suit. Any rate, that's a clear memory, and I was 4 years old. But I have other memories that don't involve history, just childish things. The little boy next door, whose name was Robert, we were in my house. This is in New York, but it's a house, it's not an apartment. And my older sister, 3 years older, is there, and Robert's older sister is there. So there are a bunch of children in my house. And they start teasing Robert and me and telling Robert to kiss me. And finally, he and I agreed that he would do that, but not while they were all looking. We would go outside and he would kiss me. And so Robert and I, both 4 years old, go outside and he goes like this on my cheek. And they were all looking through the window laughing. I mean, that's just a very silly childhood memory.
How did
Uh,
it feel? Did you like it?
Uh, it was kind of, it felt kind of dangerous, as like something we maybe
Ah,
should do, but they were all telling us to do it. And then it felt humiliating that they had all been watching and laughing.
you poor people. How long did you know Robert? Because maybe when you met him again years later, it's like
I
very
never
awkward.
met him again. We moved away from the war began. My father had to go overseas. My mother is expecting a baby. And so she takes us to her home and to my grandparents in Pennsylvania. So Robert is gone from my life. And his last name was Rose, Robert Rose. If you're out there somewhere, you'd be 87 years old.
Oh my gosh, that's
I bet I
crazy.
was the first girl he ever kissed.
What was the first kiss you had that you enjoyed?
Well, that would be like most females to whom you would address that question would come up with a time in their teenage years. And I went to a girls' school in New York. I mentioned New York, but in the meantime, I'd gone to Pennsylvania to live throughout elementary school while my dad was away in the war. War ends, and then we go to Japan to live. Dad has to stay there, and he's on the staff of the hospital in Tokyo. So I live in Japan until I'm 13, and then back to Pennsylvania. And at any rate, I end up back in New York as a teenager, and I now go to a private school, which is all girls. So there wasn't the kind of teenage romance and dating that I envision kids in public high schools doing. Maybe I've watched too many TV sitcoms. But it was a very academic school, and I loved that. But I'm evading your question just because I'm trying desperately to remember. But I did acquire a boyfriend the summer that I graduated from high school, and he kissed me. No more than that, because those were the 50s when we were all very very good girls, or what passed for good girls in those days. And so that would have been when I was 17. I graduated from high school just after my 17th birthday, and then I went to college in the fall. So that was a summer romance, and he was an older man. He was
Huh?
22.
Oh my goodness.
He was in theological school, studying to become a Lutheran minister. So he was a good boy too, but he did kiss me. And then I went off to college and he went back to pursue his career. And that's the end of that. One time, though, after computers and all of this access, I Googled his name. I mean, this is years later. I was maybe in my 60s. And I started thinking about that summer and that boy, young man. And I Googled his name. And there he was practicing as a Lutheran minister in a certain church in a certain town. And I could click on and listen to him give a sermon. And I started to do that. I clicked and I listened to about 3 minutes. And he was so pompous and sounded so unlike anybody I would ever have liked
Oh
that
no.
I didn't listen to the whole thing. But I hope he went on to have a fulfilled and happy life.
That is crazy. Are you Lutheran too, or no?
No. I think my father probably was, because my father was the son of Norwegian immigrants, and Scandinavians are largely Lutheran. But my father, his father died when he was still a high school student, and they were very poor. So he got a scholarship to college and to graduate school, but it was at a Jesuit university. So
Oh,
my
okay.
father knew every Catholic prayer there was. And if he had been a Lutheran, he forgot that, though he didn't become a Catholic. So no, I was not.
Do you
I went to Presbyterian Sunday school as a child, but I have often said, this is in Pennsylvania where we lived during my childhood, during the war. Dad is gone. Every Sunday I went dutifully to Sunday school at the Presbyterian Church, but my real church was 2 blocks away, the public library.
Hmm.
That's the place I worshiped. And I don't mean that facetiously. I ho-hummed my way through Sunday school, but it meant nothing to me. The library meant so much to me, the world of literature. And that's why I went on to tried to study literature in college. Of course, as I described, I dropped out, but that was my religion.
And would you say that still is now?
Yes, yes.
So, because
I
that's,
belong I belong to no organized religion, but I still feel that worship of literature.
and worship of literature, does that mean like deep appreciation for literature?
For language, for the flow and cadence of language, and now I'm including, of course, poetry, but for the thoughts of people, of great writers, uh, for their philosophies and thoughts and beliefs, all of which I take in and absorb and reject some, don't agree with some, but all of which I value and which become part of me.
Hmm.
So as I hope in a much smaller way, the things I write become part of the storehouse of knowledge and thought and feelings in the lives of the children who read what I write.
Yeah. Can you remember a sentence or a specific passage from a book that really hit you, that you really resonated with?
But before I tell it to you, I will explain that, like all children of my generation, our earliest books were the Bobbsey Twins series, another series called Uncle Wiggily, which was about a talking rabbit, other innocuous books that had mildly charming stories, but went no deeper than that.
Hmm.
And then when I was 8 years old, I still have it in the other room. I could show it to you if it were here. My family's copy of a book that had been published for adults. My mother realized that I was a child who would appreciate it. And it was called The Yearling. I don't know if you know that book.
Yeah.
Okay. And our copy of The Yearling was a beautiful edition with illustrations by N.C. Wyeth, the father of
Wow.
Andrew Wyeth, and they were beautiful illustrations. So my mother began by reading that to me at bedtime. She read a chapter a night. And part way through, I took it over and read the rest of it to myself. But I do remember, and this is the answer to your question, there was a chapter in which two things. The boy's father, and they live in a life of desperate poverty, unlike my life. I mean, my grandfather with whom I lived was a bank president,
Hmm.
but we had servants in our house. But here I'm introduced and I'm allowed to enter a world of people who are poor and their lives are tragic in some ways and they experience real tragedies as the Bobbsey twins never did. There is a chapter in which the boy's father has been bitten by a rattlesnake and he's perhaps dying. And the illustration shows him lying there in bed with his face very pale. And the boy is sitting on the floor with his head leaning against the quilt on the bed. And in the corner, the doctor is nodding off. And that my mother read that chapter aloud. And of course, it's grippingly suspenseful as this event happens. But the final sentence in the chapter, speaking of the boy, says he was filled with hate for all death and pity for all aloneness. And when my mother read that line, she began to cry. And I'd
Hmm.
never seen my mother cry before.
Wow.
I realize as an adult, looking back on it, rereading the sentence, remembering my mother, that she was crying for herself. Her husband is on an island in the Pacific. The war news is terrible. And she reads that sentence and she weeps for herself. However, one more thing about that particular chapter. The illustration that I described shows the boy leaning against the bed, his hands are in his lap, and there's a caption under the painting, under the illustration. And it's a line from the chapter, and it says, "The vigil was in his hands."
Hmm.
When my mother left my bedroom, she left the book beside me, and I looked at that picture again and again and read that line. And I didn't know what many words in the book meant. What was a vigil? The vigil was in his hands. And I would look at his hands, and a vigil must be something very small. And I would try occasionally to reproduce that scene. I would sit beside my own bed and I would look at the painting and I would arrange my hands. I would put a crayon in my hands. That was my vigil. The vigil was in her hands. Overly dramatic as a child. But that's a line, the line that I mentioned earlier, the line where my mother wept, is the line that came to my mind when you asked me if I remembered any particular sentence from a book. Incidentally, that makes me remember just within the past 3 weeks, I got a I get emails every day from readers, from people who have read something I've written. And so every morning I look at the list of emails and I answer them. And I got an email from an adult mentioning a line from my book, The Giver, and asking if I would write that for her so she would have it in my handwriting. So I wrote out the line and I photographed it and I emailed it back to her. A couple of weeks later, she sent me a photograph of her leg, and she had my handwriting tattooed on her leg,
Oh, wow.
a line from the book. And the line was, "Of course, he needed to care. It was the meaning of everything." So, at any rate, that's very touching
Wow.
that the line meant so much to her that she would have it engraved on her own body. I would not have gone that far myself with a line from a book, but I understand the wish to make it part of you if it means so much.
You must get tons of emails. Do you answer all of them every day?
Yes. Um,
Wow.
Very often they are ones that I can answer with a stock reply. The most frequent question that I get is, "How did you get the idea for The Giver?" Well, I've written that out and I just cut and paste it into my reply because I can't answer it 27 different ways. There's only one answer to it. But the emails that I spend time giving more thought to and answering at more length are the ones that really come from the heart of the person, talking about what a book has meant to them personally.
Hmm.
And I love hearing that because I'm so aware that the book that I write is not the same book that another person reads because I bring my own memories and hopes and dreams and fears to what I write. But the reader brings their own stuff and they create their own book. And so we sort of together, it's kind of a working relationship. I don't know if I'm explaining that very
Oh,
clearly.
yeah. No, yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
I'm very touched when somebody coming from their own background finds special meaning in something I've written. And that happens every day. I'm sorry, I keep the ones that are very meaningful, I have kept on my computer, but because I'm looking at you on my computer, I can't go to them now and quote them for you. But one woman, and very often they're from adults who are looking back on a book that's meant something. And quite recently, I had one from a woman who said she's now a lawyer, has a happy family, has children, husband, practices law, has a very happy life. But she says, "I think reading The Giver saved my life." And she goes back to explain
hmm,
why. And that was very, very moving to me.
wow. You know, do you, for you, like, do you think that's the most beautiful thing about life is the fact that you write these books that connect with people and
I
actually,
think I think the connection with people, well, it doesn't have to be me writing a book. I think the way people connect to each other is, how did you phrase your question? Is that the most beautiful thing about life? I think it is. I think people's connections to one another constitute the most important thing in this world that we're all part of. And the failure to connect is probably the most tragic thing that happens in our world, and takes tragic forms.
failure to connect being what way? Like,
Uh, Failures of empathy, for example,
okay.
the inability to understand what others are feeling, which makes for conflict, and at its worst makes for warfare. And yeah, terrible things happen. Let me go back and explain something. I mentioned two people in particular who had reacted to the book The Giver. That seems to be the one that people have the strongest reaction to. There are three books that follow The Giver, and they form a quartet of
Hmm.
books and follow the same characters. I didn't plan there to be sequels, but when I wrote The Giver, and when I wrote the first one, the boy, who's the main character in the book, has a special capacity that he's not able to describe very well, but the reader can sense what he's talking about. He says he has the ability to see beyond.
Yeah.
And that's kind of vague. So in the second book, which I wrote several years later, and the main character is a girl, I decided to give her also a special ability. I have to think back now. It's been a long time since I've reread these books. But there's a point to my going through this. This girl, her ability is in her hands. She uses threads which she dyes herself using natural, ways. I had to research how to make different colors out of natural uh, growth herbs and things. And when she embroiders with these threads, she can see the future. Her hands move almost magically and show her what the future will be.
Hmm.
Okay, so that's a special ability she has. Third book, okay, a main character's a boy, and he has the ability to heal. He discovers it first when he finds a frog in the woods, and the frog's leg has been partially torn off by some animal predator. And he touches it and he feels this sensation in his own body, which is almost painful and exhausts him. But when he goes back the next day, he finds the same frog in the same place, and the leg is repaired. And he
Hmm.
realizes he has this ability to heal. And that becomes part of the plot of the book. Okay, so then I was writing the fourth book, which is the longest of all four, because it takes all the characters from the previous books and lets the reader see what happened and how they are connected in the end. And the main character in the fourth book is a 14-year-old boy. He's the one who was a baby in the first book. Okay. His name is Gabriel. And so I had to decide what ability, what capacity would I give him. And I decided that he realizes at first he's watching in the village where he lives, he's watching a village festival, and there's a wrestling match, and two of the local men are wrestling. And he suddenly feels himself in their bodies, feels what it feels like to wrestle and uh, to sweat and be in pain, and then to be victorious and to stand up and everybody's cheering. And he's able to put himself into that other person. And he tests it out in other ways and realizes he has this ability.
Hmm.
He gives it a name. He doesn't tell anybody about it, but he calls it veering, VEER, moving into another person. And he uses it at the end, at the climax of the book. Okay, what he's describing, though the word is not used, is what I think is probably the most important capacity that a human can have, and it's empathy. He is feeling the feelings of other people.
Hmm.
So that now I've forgotten what your question was, but it was something about. No, do you remember what you asked me?
Oh, what the most beautiful thing about life is and connection with people. And
Oh,
then you
okay.
said
Yes,
the
yes, and
worst thing is not connection with people,
yes,
basically.
yeah. And the worst thing would be the inability to feel what other people feel. And the most important thing is empathy, the ability to put yourself into the place of another human being. And people, if everyone had a highly developed empathetic ability, there would be no war, for example.
Hmm.
So
You,
I leave you with that thought.
you know, because I know you've gone for your own sufferings, many. I mean, your sister passed away, and then you also lost your son. Do you, was there a particular person or um, moment in your life during any of these times of great suffering when you received some very empathetic um, behavior from someone or just something and that really was meaningful to you?
One thing immediately came to my mind when you asked that question. And this will show you how closely connected to literature I am, I guess. When my son was killed, of course, I got letters from everyone and even from strangers because the circumstances of my son's death meant it was a news item and it was on 60 Minutes and it was 2 pages in Time magazine. So everybody out there knew of it and people who knew me, of course, wrote, but strangers also wrote. At any rate, I among that huge stack of mail came a note from a man whom I did know. He has died, but he was a Shakespearean actor, Albert
Hmm.
Duclos. I had watched him in Twelfth Night on the stage playing Malvolio. At any rate, that's not important, but he he wrote me just a brief quotation from Shakespeare. It's from excuse me, from Macbeth. There is a scene in Macbeth. I should know this better because I was an English major after all. But the character of Macduff finds is told that his wife and children have been murdered, and
Hmm.
he becomes incoherent with grief. And another character, and I've forgotten which one it is, says to him this phrase, and it's what my friend wrote to me. And it says, give sorrow words. The I've forgotten the adjective, the overfraught heart. I'm not gonna remember the quotation, but will surely break if you don't give it words.
Hmm.
And so that was
Hmm.
important to me, and in part because what I found after that tragedy, that often people who knew me and who would see me afterward. If I mentioned my son's name, they would change the subject. It was too painful. They didn't feel comfortable, and every time they did that, turned away from the sadness of it, sort of killed him again to me. Their inability to remember, well, not to remember him, but to speak of him. And when Albert wrote to me and said, "Give sorrow words," that meant a lot to me. It became important to speak of him and to let others speak of him
Hmm.
and to speak of sorrow in general, not to turn our eyes away from it. It's part of who we are.
You know, that's interesting because I feel like when people grieve, I think a lot of people don't want to mention it or want to give you space because they don't want to cause you pain.
Yes, yeah. And that's a legitimate way to feel, of course. And yet it causes a different kind of pain too. look away.
Hmm. Do you think there's a good balance in that way?
Oh, well, surely there is. Yeah, and I'm sure there are special people who feel who come to that balance intuitively. But it's hard for people. It's a hard time, both for the person who has suffered the tragedy and those who don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, but I guess from what I'm hearing you say, it's best to try
Of
instead
course
of
it is. Yeah.
just,
In fact, I remember getting a card from someone who simply, was a standard Hallmark card with a sad poem of some sort. And then she had written at the bottom, I have no words, and signed her name. And I remember
oh,
feeling kind of pissed off about that and thinking, you could try to find some. But, that was her acknowledging her own lack. And I understand that. And I've probably done the same thing myself on occasion.
well, Lois, I first of all want to thank you for your time, but I have one more question before we end. What, because we were talking about this a little bit before the interview started, but what do you want people to remember most about you? Because obviously you're in the, I don't know what you call it, what, twilight years of your life, where it's like, I don't know how you call it, but it's like you're retired and things are winding down in a way. I mean, you're still
Yeah.
writing and everything, but you're closer than me, in the,
To the end of it, yes. And in
yeah.
fact, somebody asked me just within the past few days, uh, I can't remember who, and it doesn't matter who, but it was in an interview also. And this person said, what do you look forward to? You've experienced so much over your long life. What do you hope to experience? And I said, I've had a long and successful. I had a successful career doing something I love. I've had children and grandchildren to whom I'm close and whom I love. I've traveled. I've been on every continent. And I said, there's not really anything more that I want to do. I would like to look forward to just a life of watching flowers grow in my garden, knitting a sweater, reading a great book. Uh, I can't remember again now what you
Oh,
asked
I
me.
I was like, how
Uh,
how do you want to
oh,
be remembered?
how do I want to be remembered? Was that it? Or
Yeah.
I I mentioned the letters I get from people who have found something that has touched them personally. And I guess for me, that's the best legacy that I can leave to maybe not even in my books, people like my children and grandchildren who have been touched by me in some way that's important. I guess that's all anybody hopes for, whatever your profession, uh, to have touched others in ways that are meaningful and positive.
Is it, and I know I just have a follow-up question. I was going to say, is it something do you mind? Because, some people really don't like talking about dying, even when they're old. They're like, no, I don't really want to talk about it. Please don't talk about it. It's like, okay, I respect that. But, for you, is that something you don't like to talk about?
No, it's to me, it seems like life is a continuum, birth, death at each end, and it's a journey you make, and there are adventures along the way. And I don't believe in an afterlife. That is very unchristian of me. Sorry about that. But
Very non-Lutheran of you.
that's right, not Presbyterian either. Um, I think dying is the entrance to whatever comes next. I kind of well, if you look at or are privy to, I've just been in New York, and the New York Planetarium has a film that does this. The telescopes that are out there now that are showing us the universe, which is so immense that we can't even conceive of it. I mean, we're smaller than a grain of sand in all of Florida's coast. And out there is all this whatever, and we don't know anything about it. I find that very exhilarating because I think when I die, and when my son died, and when my sister died, and my grandparents and my ancestors, they became part of that. And I will become part of that. And maybe that's the next adventure. I have to look at it that way. So it's not that I'm looking forward to it necessarily, but I don't fear it. I kind of am very curious.
And it's
I,
so
I
interesting. I
don't
think
think I'll be sitting on a cloud and having wings. But everybody has a different way of speculating, and that's all we can do because nobody really knows.
hmm. Well, Lois, again, I was fascinated. You are such a good storyteller, which is why you write
That's my
books. But I'm
profession.
just sitting here like, oh, I love her stories. Just keep going.
And we could do this for hours, but we shouldn't.
I know, because it's not popular now. Must be short, right? No long talks. But anyway, thank you so much. It was so great to meet you in a Zoom way here.
Yeah, I really like Zoom. A lot of people don't. But during the pandemic, when I was very isolated, my husband was in the hospital for 84 days with COVID, so I was
Hmm.
even more isolated. But I Zoomed with kids all over the world, classrooms in Korea, Turkey, Romania. They just all needed something because they were isolated also. And I grew to like Zoom a lot. It feels very intimate. I feel as if we're sitting in the same room.
Yeah, me too. I know. It's interesting. I've interviewed several individuals though where it's very uncomfortable because they like the phone or they like to be in person.
I
I
hate
think
the
it's
phone.
still, yeah.
I hate the phone because I like to see the person I'm talking to.
Yeah, I don't like the phone either. It's not the best, but all right, Lois. Well, I'm gonna let you go. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad you got in touch with me, and this was fun.
I'm glad you said yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.